She didn't know she'd been sold until the morning she was handed a bill of sale with her own name written at the top. Mara Ellison stood in the doorway of what used to be her family's home, the place where her mother had hung dried lavender above the kitchen window, and her father had carved their initials into the porch post, and she read the document twice because the first time didn't make sense. Her brother Silas had signed her over. Not the land, not the livestock. Her labor, her time. The next 3 years of her life, transferred like a head of cattle to settle a debt she hadn't known existed, owed to a man the whole county called dangerous. If you've ever had someone you trusted hand your future to a stranger without asking, stay with me, like follow, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The lawyer's name was Cutter Doyle, and he had the kind of face that had learned long ago not to show what it was thinking. He sat across the kitchen table from Mara with his hands folded and his hat resting on his knee, and he waited while she finished reading the document for the second time. Outside, the wind was moving through the cottonwoods the way it did every morning in early October, slow and indifferent, rattling the dry leaves against each other like loose coins. Inside, the kitchen smelled like cold ash, and something spoiling in the pantry that nobody had bothered to deal with since their mother died 6 weeks ago. Their father had gone first, back in the spring, a quiet man taken by a loud illness that had been eating him from the inside without announcing itself. Their mother had followed him the way she'd followed him everywhere in life. Not immediately, not without struggle, but inevitably. Silas had stood at both funerals with his hat in his hands and his eyes red, and said all the right things to all the right people. Mara had believed him. That was the thing she couldn't stop circling back to. She had believed him. "Where is he?" she asked, without looking up from the document. "Mr. Ellison left Harlan County yesterday morning," Doyle said. "He asked me to deliver this and to— I didn't ask what he asked you to do." She set the document on the table and looked at the lawyer. "I asked where he is." Doyle shifted slightly. "He didn't tell me his destination." She was 23 years old. She had her mother's jaw and her father's stubbornness, and she had spent the last 6 weeks managing an estate that was more debt than asset, dealing with creditors and neighbors and a county clerk who had twice tried to talk her into selling the house before she'd had time to grieve properly. She was not a woman who fell apart in front of people she didn't know. She had learned that early. She looked back at the document. It was 2 pages, written in the cramped legal hand that Doyle favored, and it was thorough. Silas had owed Rhett Mercer $460. Gambling debts accumulated over 8 months at 3 different establishments across 2 counties, plus interest that had been accumulating at a rate that suggested Silas had not been making any payments at all. The original arrangement, before Doyle had apparently gotten involved to formalize it, had been for Silas to work off the debt on Black Viper Ranch. But Silas, in his infinite wisdom, had determined that he was not suited to ranch work. This part was not in the document, but Mara could read it between every line, and had negotiated an alternative. His sister would go instead. 3 years of labor on Black Viper Ranch, room and board provided. The debt cleared in full upon completion. Her name, her years, her body's work. Signed away in Silas's unsteady handwriting on a Tuesday morning while she'd been in town dealing with the feed store account. "This isn't legal," she said. "It's a labor contract," Doyle said carefully. "It's binding under— It's a labor contract for someone who didn't sign it." She pushed it across the table toward him. "I didn't sign this. My brother signed this. My brother doesn't own me." Doyle looked at this document and then back at her, and she could see him working through something behind his careful expression. "Miss Ellison," he said, "Mr. Mercer is prepared to— Mr. Mercer can go straight to hell." A long silence. The cottonwood leaves rattled outside. Doyle folded the document carefully and put it back in his coat pocket. He stood, picked up his hat, and put it on. He was a tall man, lean in the way that some men got when they'd been through something hard and hadn't fully recovered. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said, which she suspected was not his natural instinct. "The debt is real. Your brother is gone. If Mr. Mercer decides to pursue the legal route, and he has grounds, Miss Ellison, I want you to understand that the judgment would likely fall on the estate. There isn't enough left in this estate to satisfy it. So they take the house. They take the house, the land, Whatever's left. She looked at the table, at the water ring where someone, her mother probably, had left a cup without a coaster years ago, and the mark had never fully come out. These small, permanent records of people who were gone. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. "Mr. Mercer would like you on the ranch by end of week." "That's not an answer to my question," Doyle considered. "A few days?" "I'd say a few days." He left. She listened to his horse move away down the lane, and then she sat at the table alone in the kitchen that smelled like cold ash, and she looked at the water ring her mother had left, and she let herself be furious for exactly as long as it took to figure out what she was going to do. She rode out to talk to Dale Pruitt, who had been her father's closest friend, and who ran a small law practice out of the back of his house on the north side of Harlan. Dale was 60-something and mostly retired and half-deaf in his left ear, but he knew more about county law than anyone who actually charged for the service. He read the copy she'd made of the document. She'd copied it out herself before Doyle left, sitting at the kitchen table with her hand moving fast and steady. And he drank his coffee and didn't say anything for a long time. "Well," he said finally, "is it binding?" "It's—" He turned the paper over as if looking for something on the back. "It's not nothing, is the problem. If Mercer's lawyer wanted to make the case that this represents your brother acting as executor of the estate, there's no estate left to execute. There's the house." She had known that. She'd said it herself in the kitchen an hour ago. But hearing it from Dale made it feel different, more fixed, more like something that was already decided. "Even if it went to court," Dale said, "even if you won, and I'm not saying you wouldn't, the legal costs alone would likely—" He spread his hands. She understood. Legal costs were another way of losing everything, just slower. "What do you know about Rhett Mercer?" she asked. Dale looked at her over his coffee cup. "What do you know?" "I've heard his name. Everybody's heard his name. People act like saying it too loud is going to summon something." "He's not a ghost." Dale set the cup down. "He's a man. Came to Harlan County about 8 years ago, bought the Viper Range land from the Calloway estate when old Porter Calloway drank himself out of business. Built it up from nothing, or close enough to nothing that the difference doesn't matter. He runs about 600 head now, maybe more." "And the reputation?" Dale was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't back down from things," he said finally. "There was a dispute about water rights 3 years back. With the Deacon brothers, you might remember. They pushed. He pushed back harder. It went badly for the Deacons." "How badly?" "They moved counties." She took that in. "Did he do something illegal?" "Not that anyone could prove." Dale turned the document over again. "A nervous habit." "He's not a man who cheats, from what I know. He doesn't lie about what he is or what he wants. The reputation mostly comes from the fact that he doesn't soften things for people's feelings." "So he's mean." "He's direct," Dale said. "There's a difference, though I'll grant you it doesn't always feel like one when you're on the receiving end." She rode home the long way, through the back fields where her father had tried to grow winter wheat the year before he got sick, and the crop had come up thin and they'd all pretended it was fine. The sky was doing something beautiful above the ridge, going orange and bruised purple, the way autumn skies did in this part of the country, all that color just sitting there while the land below got cold and dark. She barely saw it. She had 3 choices as she counted them. She could refuse and fight it in court and probably lose the house. She could run, leave Harlan County, start somewhere else with nothing and nobody. Or she could go to Black Viper Ranch, keep the house intact and technically hers, and work out the 3 years. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid exactly, more because she was trying to understand how she felt about the things she'd already decided. She arrived at Black Viper Ranch on a Friday morning, 2 days after Doyle's visit, with a single trunk in the back of a borrowed wagon and a temper she had been carefully banking for 48 hours. The ranch sat back from the main road about a mile, at the end of a lane that ran between 2 long pasture fences. The land around it was serious land, not the pretty kind that got painted on calendars, but the kind that looked like it meant something, dark soil and good grass and a creek running through the low ground that she could hear before she could see it. The house itself was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories, stone and timber, with a long porch and a barn behind it that was bigger than the house. There were corrals to the east with horses in them, working horses, not the decorative kind. Beyond the barn, she could see the start of a bunkhouse and another structure she couldn't identify from the lane. A ranch hand she didn't know came out from the barn when she pulled the wagon up and looked at her without saying anything. "I'm looking for Rhett Mercer," she said. "He knows you're coming." The man, young, maybe 20, with a sunburned neck and watchful eyes, looked at her trunk and then back at her face. "I'll put your horse up." "I'll put my own horse up," she said. "Where is he?" "A beat. North pasture, probably. He'll be back by noon." It wasn't noon yet. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, unhitched the horse, and led her toward the barn. The young hand followed at a slight distance, which she suspected was instruction. Watch the new arrival. Make sure she doesn't do anything. The barn was orderly in the way that serious working barns were orderly. Not clean exactly, but organized. Everything had a place and was in it. The stalls were good, and the horses were well kept, and the smell was honest barn smell, hay and manure and old wood, and the particular warmth that animals made in enclosed spaces. She settled her horse, paid attention to that rather than to the young hand watching her from the doorway, and then she walked back outside and looked at the house. Rhett Mercer was standing on the porch. She hadn't heard him come in. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He was watching her with the kind of attention that didn't advertise itself, the kind that some men use to make other people feel like they'd already made an error before they opened their mouth. He was taller than she'd built him in her mind, which had not been short. Broad through the shoulders in a way that was about work, not vanity. Dark hair going a little gray at the sides, which put him somewhere in his mid-30s or early 40s. It was hard to say. His face was weathered and his eyes were... She noticed this first and then tried to stop noticing it. A pale color, gray or something close to it, and they were looking at her with an expression that she could not immediately read. He came down off the porch. Not fast, not slow. Just came down like a man who was going somewhere that he owned. "Miss Ellison," he said. "Mr. Mercer." They stood about 8 feet apart. The wind came through the yard and moved the dust around their feet. "I want you to understand something before we get started," she said. "I'm here because the alternative was losing my family's home, and I couldn't let that happen. I want that on the table between us. I'm not here because I agreed to this arrangement, or because I think it's fair, or because I have any goodwill toward you personally. I don't know you. But I know my brother sold something that wasn't his to sell, and I know you took it, and I want you to know that I know that." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not offense, exactly. She couldn't name it. "Are you finished?" he asked. "I'm just getting started." "No," he said. "I mean, are you done saying what you needed to say before we could talk?" She considered that. "Yes." "All right." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "I took a debt that your brother offered to settle. I didn't ask for this particular settlement. It was his suggestion. You can be angry about that at him, if you can find him. You being here..." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't force you. You came. Because you left me no real choice." "There's always a choice." He said it without heat, without cruelty, just like it was true. "You made the one you could live with. I understand that. So here's what I'll tell you about this ranch. The work is real, and it's hard, and I don't have patience for people who don't do what they say they're going to do. I keep my word. I expect the same. Beyond that..." He looked toward the barn, then back at her. "You're not a prisoner here. You eat when the hands eat. You sleep in the house, second room on the right at the top of the stairs. You answer to me on ranch work. Anything outside of that is your own time." She waited to see if there was more. "That's it?" she said. "That's it." She had come here ready for something uglier. She'd spent 2 nights sharpening herself against a version of this man that apparently didn't entirely match the actual one, and she wasn't sure yet what to do with the discrepancy. "What would the work be?" she said. "Specifically. What can you do?" "Most things." She paused. "I'm better with horses than cattle. I can read and write and keep books. I can cook, though I'd rather not make it my primary job. I know how to use a rifle." Something in his face shifted slightly. Not quite a smile. "Most of the hands can't keep books worth a damn," he said. "I spend 2 hours every Sunday trying to make the ledger make sense." I can fix that. I know you can, he said. I had Doyle look into you before he delivered the document. You ran your parents' household accounts for the last 3 years. She looked at him. You investigated me. I investigated the situation. There's a difference. He said it evenly, but she could see that he understood she wasn't going to find that distinction entirely satisfying. If I'm taking on a person I don't know, I want to know something about them. And what did you find out? That you're competent, that you don't owe anyone money, that the feed store clerk in town apparently finds you difficult to deal with. Despite herself, despite all of it, the kitchen table and the water ring and the 48 hours of cold anger, she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Just slightly. Hank Briggs has been giving me the wrong grain mix for 6 months and refusing to admit it, she said. I know, Mercer said. I've had the same argument with him. A brief silence, not hostile. Come inside, he said. I'll show you the ledger. Calmed. The inside of the house was not what she'd expected either, though she was starting to understand that she should stop expecting anything specific about this place. It was spare, not uncomfortable, but not decorated in any way that suggested anyone was trying to make it look like a home rather than a functional place to live. The furniture was good and solid and had probably been here when he bought the ranch. The kitchen was large and organized with the same quality as the barn. Everything in its place, nothing wasted. There was a long table in the main room where she could see papers stacked at one end, a lamp, a coffee cup with a ring left in it from this morning. A woman came out of the kitchen when they came in. 60s, stocky, gray hair pulled back, wiping her hands on a cloth. She looked at Mara with an expression that was not unfriendly but was certainly evaluating. Mrs. Tuck, Mercer said, this is Mara Ellison. She'll be taking the second room. I heard the wagon. Mrs. Tuck looked Mara over. You eaten? Not since this morning. Sit down then. She disappeared back into the kitchen. Mercer brought the ledger from the stack of papers on the table and set it in front of her. It was a large cloth-bound book. And when she opened it, she understood immediately why he spent 2 hours every Sunday on it. The entries were in at least 3 different hands, inconsistently labeled, with column headings that shifted meaning from page to page. Someone had added a whole separate section in the back margin for cattle sales that wasn't connected to anything in the main body of the book. Who's been keeping this? She asked. Whoever had time, he said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Pete, one of the senior hands, does most of it. He can do math, but he doesn't have any system. He doesn't have any system, she confirmed, turning pages. It's not wrong exactly, it's just... She looked up. This would take me probably a week to straighten out, the back entries. After that, I could keep it current without much trouble. What would you need? A proper ledger. This one's half full of bad entries. I'd want to start fresh and transfer the relevant numbers. She paused. And I'd want to understand the operations well enough to know what I'm recording. I can't keep books for something I don't understand. He looked at her for a moment. That means time on the ranch, not just at a desk. That's what I said. Mrs. Tuck came back with a plate, bread, cold meat, something pickled, a cup of coffee, and set it in front of Mara and then looked at Mercer with an expression that was clearly asking him something he chose not to answer out loud. She went back to the kitchen. She doesn't like surprises, Mercer said. Did you tell her I was coming? I told her this week. When this week? A pause. This morning. So she doesn't like you either, Mara said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. She'd meant it as an internal observation. He looked at her. That thing moved across his face again. She still couldn't name it, but it was in the vicinity of something human. Mrs. Tuck has been running this kitchen for 4 years, he said. She doesn't like being the last to know things. That's fair. It is, Mara agreed. She picked up the bread. She was hungry in a way she hadn't registered until the food was in front of her, the way hunger worked sometimes when you'd been angry for 2 days. She ate. He sat across from her and didn't make conversation, which she found, unexpectedly, less hostile than comfortable silence would normally feel with a stranger. He had a way of being present without demanding anything, and she was tired enough from the last 2 days that she was grateful for it, even if she didn't want to be. So. The ranch had 11 hands plus Mercer himself. She met most of them that first afternoon when she went out to learn the layout of the place. The senior hand was a man named Pete Gideon, weathered and quiet and approximately 50, with the kind of competence that came from decades of doing one thing well and no particular interest in explaining it to anyone. He showed her the pastures and the creek layout and the location of the North and South Line camps without much commentary, and when she asked questions, he answered them concisely and without condescension, which she appreciated. There was a younger man named Cole who talked too much and smiled too easily and had clearly decided within the first 10 minutes that he was going to be charming to the new arrival. She was not unfriendly to him, but she was not charmed. There was a woman, this surprised her, named Bessie Harlow, who handled the horses and who shook Mara's hand with a grip that felt like a statement, and then went back to what she was doing. Mara made a mental note about Bessie and filed it under people to talk to more. The young hand from that morning was named Eli, and he was 18 and had been on the ranch for 6 months and still had the slight wariness of someone not entirely sure they belonged. She recognized it because she was feeling something adjacent to it herself. Mercer rode with her on the East Pasture tour, and she noticed things about him the way she noticed things about animals she was trying to understand. Not consciously exactly, but cataloging. He rode well, not showily but naturally, in the way that meant it was as unconscious as walking. He watched the cattle when they rode past them with a particular quality of attention that was not quite the same as the way he watched people. More settled, like the cattle were a language he'd read so long it was automatic. He didn't tell her things she hadn't asked. He didn't fill silence with noise. These were qualities she'd been trained by her mother to consider virtues, but she was aware they could also be someone's way of keeping things hidden, and she hadn't decided which applied here. "The Deacon brothers," she said at one point, as they were riding back along the creek. "Dale Pruitt told me about them." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "Pruitt's a gossip." "He's thorough," she said. "What happened with the Deacons?" Another pause. Longer. She watched his face in profile, the set of his jaw, the way he was looking at the tree line rather than at her. "They decided that the creek that runs through the south boundary was theirs," he said. "They had a survey that they claimed supported their position. The survey was—" He stopped. "It was wrong. I won't say forged, but someone had been helpful to them with the numbers. And you pushed back." "I pushed back." He said it flatly, no drama in it. "They pushed back harder. Things got uncomfortable for a while." "How uncomfortable?" He glanced at her. "I'm still here, and they're not," he said. "Make of that what you will." She made of it what she could and left it alone. Octet. The first week was the hardest. Not because of anything she hadn't anticipated. The work was hard, but she'd done hard work her whole life, and the specific skills required weren't beyond her. But because of the particular loneliness of being somewhere new and unwillingly, of making herself useful in a place she hadn't chosen, of being watched by people who were deciding what they thought of her and mostly keeping those decisions to themselves. Pete watched her without comment. Bessie watched her with slightly more openness. Cole kept trying to make her laugh and would settle for a smile. Mrs. Tuck watched her most carefully of all and said almost nothing about what she saw, which was either respect or withholding, and Mara couldn't tell which. Mercer didn't watch her exactly, or rather he watched everything, and she was part of everything, and so she was watched, but not specifically, not with any agenda she could identify. She worked on the ledger in the evenings at the long table, transferring what was recoverable from the old book into a new one she'd bought in town on the third day. The lamp cast a yellow circle, and outside the windows the autumn dark settled in early and the temperature dropped sharply after sunset. Mrs. Tuck brought coffee without being asked. Mercer sat at the other end of the table most evenings with his own papers, and they didn't talk much, and the silence between them was strange, not comfortable, not hostile. Something else. A negotiated peace, maybe. Two people each deciding the other wasn't going to ambush them. On the 6th day, Pete came to find her in the barn, where she was working with one of the horses that had come up lame the day before. "Fence is down on the south line," he said. 3 sections, maybe more. Cattle are moving toward the creek crossing." "What happened to the fence?" "Cut," he said. She looked at him. "Not broken." "Cut," he said again. Flat, certain. They went together, along with Cole and Eli, and she saw it herself. The clean diagonal lines in the wire that were not what wind or cattle or time made. 3 sections down, yes, and the cattle had moved toward the water the way cattle always did when they had the chance. She helped string temporary wire, while Pete sent Eli back for Mercer and for more proper supplies. The work was rough and fast, and her hands were bleeding a little by the time Mercer arrived, from the wire and from moving too fast in the cold. He rode the line with Pete and came back with a face that was careful in the way his face was careful when he was thinking about something that concerned him. "Second time this month," he said. Mara looked at him. "There was another cut fence? East line. We thought it was wire failure." He looked at the temporary repair she'd done. "It wasn't." "Someone's pushing cattle," Pete said. "Someone's testing," Mercer said. "Whether we'll notice, whether we'll do anything about it." "Who?" Mara asked. Both men looked at her, and she realized that they'd been about to have a conversation they weren't sure included her yet. She didn't step back from it. "Could be a few people," Mercer said finally. "This range has been fought over since before I bought it." "Which few people specifically?" Another look between him and Pete. Pete looked away first, not deferring exactly, but making a decision. "There's a man named Kane Hollis," Mercer said. "Runs a crew about 15 miles north. He's been in and out of trouble for most of his career out here. Cattle theft, mostly. Nothing that's been proven in any way that stuck." "Has he bothered you before?" "He tested us once, 2 years ago. We found him before anything came of it." Mercer looked at the fence line. "This feels different." "How?" He was quiet for a moment. "More patient," he said. She thought about that on the ride back. More patient. The Deacons had been loud, apparently. A legal dispute, a survey, a confrontation. This was quieter. Fence lines cut and left for the weather and the cattle to make ambiguous. A slow test of what the ranch would and wouldn't catch. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with this information. She filed it away with everything else she'd been filing. She was learning this place the way you learned any complicated thing. Not all at once, but in pieces. Each piece changing the shape of what came before it. Her hands stopped bleeding by the time they got back to the barn. She cleaned them at the pump without making a thing of it. Mercer noticed anyway. She saw him notice. He didn't say anything about it, which she found not kind exactly, but correct. She didn't need commentary on her hands. What she needed was to understand what she'd come into. And she was starting to. The letter from Silas came on a Thursday, 12 days after her arrival. It was delivered to the ranch by a postal rider who came through once a week and clearly found the Black Viper route the least interesting part of his circuit. Mrs. Tuck brought it to her at the ledger table with an expression that suggested she knew what it was. She did not open it immediately. She set it beside the ledger and kept working for another hour, because she wanted to be in a particular state of mind when she read it. Not surprised, not reactive, just clear-eyed, and ready for whatever it was. It was short. Silas had never been a writer. "Mara, I know you're angry and you have the right to be. I made a bad decision and then a worse one trying to fix it. I didn't know what else to do. Mercer isn't a bad man. I wouldn't have sent you somewhere dangerous. I need you to believe that, even if you can't forgive it. I can't come back yet. I owe other people besides Mercer, and some of them are less patient about it. I'll make it right when I can. I'm sorry." He had not signed it, just stopped there, the way someone stops a conversation by walking away. She sat with the letter for a while. The lamp flickered in a draft from somewhere, and outside the first real cold of the season was settling in, and she could hear wind working at the corners of the house. "I owe other people besides Mercer, and some of them are less patient about it." She read that line 3 times. Silas was not hiding from shame, or not just from shame, he was hiding from someone. She looked at the fence line in her mind's eye, the clean diagonal cuts. More patient, Mercer had said. She didn't know yet. She didn't have enough pieces. But something in the shape of what she was learning was starting to suggest that Silas's disappearance and the cut fences and a man named Kane Hollis might not be entirely separate problems. And the thought of that, of being inside a situation that was already connected and moving without her knowing, made her feel a cold that had nothing to do with the October night. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She went back to the ledger. She had work to do. The cold that settled in that October night didn't lift. It stayed through the following week like something that had decided it belonged there, turning the creek at the south boundary to a sluggish gray-green and putting frost on the grass before dawn that burned off slow and left the ground soft and treacherous underfoot. The cattle didn't like it. Neither did most of the hands. Mara found she didn't mind it much, which was something she hadn't expected to learn about herself in this particular place. She kept working on the ledger. By the end of her second week, she had the back entries organized into something coherent and had identified 3 separate billing errors with the feed supplier in Harlan that added up to nearly $60 in overpayments across 14 months. She brought it to Mercer at the table one evening, the relevant pages laid out side by side, and showed him. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. $60, he said finally. 57 and change. She pointed to the column. This one here was a doubled entry. Same delivery recorded twice. These 2 are pricing errors. The supplier charged for a higher grade than what was actually delivered. I found the delivery receipts in the back of the drawer. Pete files the receipts, he said. Pete files everything, she said. He just doesn't cross-check. Mercer sat back in his chair and looked at the pages and then at her. It was a particular kind of look. Not suspicious, not exactly approving, somewhere between the two. Like he was adjusting something in his mind. I'll write to Harlan Feed on Monday, he said. I already drafted the letter, she said. It's on the desk. Another pause. All right. She gathered the pages back into order. The lamp between them made a small sound, the wick needing trim, and she reached over and adjusted it without thinking about it. And when she looked up, he was still watching her. What? She said. Nothing, he said, and went back to his own papers. She didn't know what to do with Rhett Mercer. That was the honest truth of it, and she'd been circling it for 2 weeks. She had arrived here with a version of him built out of Doyle's formal manner and Dale Pruitt's careful words, and the way people in town said his name like they were setting something breakable on a high shelf. That version was hard-edged and dangerous and indifferent to other people's difficulties. And those qualities were not entirely wrong. She could see the hard edges. She could understand where the dangerous reputation came from. But the indifferent part had turned out to be inaccurate, and that mattered more than she'd expected it to. He was not indifferent. He was contained. There was a difference, and she was only now starting to understand it. She found out a piece of his history from Bessie Harlow, not because she asked, but because Bessie was a woman who shared information the way some people shared tools, practically, when it was needed, without making a ceremony of it. They were working together in the horse barn on a gray Thursday afternoon, Bessie teaching Mara the ranch's system for tracking hoof health across the remuda, a thing that had been done inconsistently before and was another area where the records were a mess. When Bessie said, without preamble, he had a place before this one, up north, near the Laramie Range. Mara didn't ask how that was relevant to hoof records. What happened to it? Lost it. Bessie ran her hand down the near foreleg of a bay gelding, checking a previous note in the log. Fire. 3 years into it, he'd borrowed money to build the barn and the bunkhouse and most of the infrastructure, and when the fire took it, there wasn't enough of anything left to rebuild and still service the debt. Was it an accident? Bessie looked at her. Officially. And unofficially? Unofficially, there was a man up there named Garrett who'd been trying to buy him out since the second year. Offered 3 times in writing, twice more when he ran into Rhett, in town. She found the note she was looking for in the log and made a mark. Nobody proved anything. Mara was quiet, thinking about the fence lines. He built this place from the Callaway wreck, Bessie continued. Bought it cheap because nobody else wanted the trouble of it. Spent 4 years making it work. He doesn't talk about the first place. I'm telling you because she stopped and looked at Mara with a directness that was characteristic. Because you have good instincts and you're going to need them, and knowing where a person came from helps. Why do I need good instincts? Mara asked. Bessie closed the log. Because whatever's happening with those fences isn't finished, she said, and you're inside it now whether you came here meaning to be or not. She said it without drama, just that flat, practical certainty, and then she handed the log to Mara and went to check the next horse. The fences were not finished. Bessie was right. The third cut came 10 days after the second, this time on the west line where the canyon wall made the terrain irregular and hard to patrol. They lost 11 head before the break was found. Cattle drifted through the gap and scattered into the rough country on the other side of the boundary marker, and it took a day and a half to bring them back, during which Cole took a fall from his horse on rocky ground and bruised 2 ribs and was in a foul mood about it for the rest of the week. Mercer rode the west line for 4 hours the day after the recovery. Mara rode part of it with him because she had asked to and he had not told her not to, which she was coming to understand was his way of saying yes to things he hadn't entirely decided about. The canyon country was hard riding, the terrain dropping and climbing without warning, and the ground frozen in patches that made the horses uncertain. "Same cut," she said when they stopped at the breakpoint. She'd learned what to look for now. The wire ends were clean, not jagged the way they went when something hit them or when they'd been pulled from years of tension finally giving out. "Same cut," he agreed. "They know the terrain," she said. "They went straight to the spot that would give them the most time before we found it." He was looking at the canyon wall above them, the dark rock face with its narrow ledges and the scrub clinging to the cracks. "Someone's ridden this land before," he said. "Not recently, but before." "Kane Hollis?" He didn't answer immediately. "Maybe. Or someone working for him," she said. "Someone who knew this range before you bought it." He looked at her then, not surprised exactly, but recalibrating again. She was getting used to that look. "The Callaway hands," he said. "Most of them scattered when the old man drank the operation under. A few went north." "Toward Hollis's range?" "I don't know." He said it like it cost him something to not know, like the not knowing was a physical irritant. "I'll find out." They rode back mostly in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than the early ones. Less like 2 people maintaining a careful distance, more like 2 people thinking about the same problem from different angles and not needing to narrate it. She was starting to feel the shape of the ranch under her, not owning it. She never confused herself about that, but understanding it, the way you understood a piece of land you'd walked many times, its low spots and its heights, and the places where the water went. The south pasture ran better than the north because the north had an underground seep that made the soil soft in a band about 40 yards wide, and cattle who grazed near it came up lame sometimes. The east barn was colder than the west because of how the canyon channeled wind. Pete always checked the water trough by the main corral last because it was the largest and the most reliable, which meant if it froze, which it sometimes did in the deep cold snaps, you found out last. She cataloged these things without meaning to. It was what she did. Built pictures of systems, found where the gaps were. Her father had said she'd been born counting things, and that was not entirely wrong. The ranch hands, for their part, had moved through several phases in their relationship with her. The first phase had been watchful uncertainty. The second had been a kind of cautious testing. Small things, nothing overtly hostile, just the natural way of any group that had its own established culture encountering something new. Cole had done most of the testing, not out of meanness, but out of a restless social instinct that needed to know where people fit. She had handled it by being competent and not making anything of it, which was the only way she knew to handle that kind of thing. The third phase was harder to name. It was something like acceptance, but tentative, qualified. Pete worked alongside her now, without the slight separateness he'd maintained the first week. Bessie had become the closest thing she had to an ally, though Bessie was not a woman who used that word. Eli, the youngest, had started bringing her questions about the ledger entries that he was technically supposed to be asking Pete about, which she thought was his way of establishing something. It was on a cold Sunday, 3 weeks after her arrival, that she had her first real conflict with one of them. His name was Vern Clasp, and he was one of the 3 hands she hadn't fully cataloged yet, a man in his mid-40s who had come to the ranch the previous spring and who Pete tolerated without exactly welcoming. He was skilled enough, she could see that, but there was something in the way he moved around the ranch that had struck her as slightly off in a way she couldn't specify. She'd been using one of the feed storage rooms off the main barn as a workspace when the weather was too cold to work at the table inside. It had a window and a shelf she could use as a desk, and it was near where she was often needed. And she came in on that Sunday to find Vern going through the feed delivery records she'd left on the shelf. He heard her come in and turned around without particular hurry, which was worse than if he'd startled. "Can I help you with something?" she said. "Just looking," he said. He set the records down. "Those are ranch records," she said. "Is there something specific you needed?" "Didn't know this was your private room," he said. There was nothing overtly aggressive in his tone, but there was something under it, a slight pressure, testing the edges of what she'd do. "It's a workspace," she said. "Those are records I'm responsible for. If you need information from them, ask me." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she recognized, the kind men sometimes put on when they'd decided a woman's claim to authority was provisional and they were deciding whether to honor it or not. "Sure," he said, and left. She stood in the storage room for a moment after he was gone. She looked at the records. They were in order. Nothing appeared to have been removed. But she couldn't be certain what he'd been looking for, or whether he'd found it. She told Mercer that evening, not as a complaint, and she was careful to present it that way. Not looking for him to do something about Vern specifically, just telling him what had happened because it was information that seemed like it might matter. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you think he was looking for?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "Feed records, delivery schedules, cattle tallies. If someone wanted to know when the ranch had a large delivery coming in, when the hands would be occupied." "The fences," he said. "I'm speculating," she said carefully. "But yes." Mercer sat with that. She watched him sit with it, the way the jaw tightened slightly and then released, the way he looked at the middle distance and came back. "I'll deal with Vern," he said. "I'm not asking you to fire him," she said. "I don't have proof of anything." "I know." He looked at her directly. "I'm not going to do anything without proof, but I'm going to watch him." She nodded. There was something in the way he'd said that, "I'll deal with Vern," that was not a dismissal. It was an acknowledgement. He was taking what she'd told him seriously, treating her read of the situation as valid, and that mattered in a way she hadn't expected to matter to her this much. She went back to the ledger. He stayed at his end of the table. The lamp burned down between them, and Mrs. Tuck came through once to bank the kitchen fire for the night and gave them both a look that said she thought reasonable people would have been in bed an hour ago. She found the discrepancy in the cattle tally on a Wednesday, 3.5 weeks after her arrival. She'd been cross-referencing the pasture rotation records with the seasonal head count, a task that should have been routine when the numbers came apart. Not dramatically, not 50 head missing, not something anyone would notice in the normal course of business. 17 head, scattered across 3 different pastures over 6 weeks, recorded in the tally as having been moved but not appearing in the destination pasture records. 17 head of cattle was not nothing. At current market weight, it was close to $400. And it had been done carefully, in pieces small enough that the individual losses would read as normal variance unless you put the whole picture together. She sat with the numbers for 2 hours, checking and rechecking, because she did not want to be wrong about this. She was not wrong. She brought it to Pete first because Pete had been here the longest and knew the pasture records better than anyone. He looked at her cross-reference table for a long time without saying anything, and then he said a word under his breath that she pretended not to hear. "How long ago did this start?" he asked. 6 weeks? Maybe a little more? Before the fences? Before the fences, she confirmed, or at the same time as the first fence cut. I can't be precise about the first one since we thought it was wire failure. Pete looked at the numbers again and then looked up at her with an expression that was, for Pete, almost open. "You should tell him," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted you to look at it first, to make sure I wasn't reading something wrong." "You're not reading it wrong." He said it with a particular flatness that told her he was angry and was managing it. "You're reading it exactly right. Someone's been bleeding this place slow and careful for 6 weeks. Mercer took the news the way she was starting to understand he took most things, without visible panic, without the kind of explosion that some men used to signal how seriously they were taking something. He sat at the table and looked at her numbers and asked 2 specific questions, one about the pasture rotation schedule and one about who had access to the tally records, and then he set the paper down. "Vern Clasp," he said. "I don't know that," she said. "I know you don't." He looked at the far wall. "I do." Something had shifted in his face. Not anger, not quite, but something older than anger, something that had been sitting there for a while under the daily surface of the man. "What do you know?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I know that Vern came to me in the spring with a letter of introduction from a man named Pharaoh in Cheyenne. I know I checked the reference and it came back clean. And I know that Pharaoh's name came up last year in a dispute that got quietly settled before it reached a judge, and that one of the parties in that dispute was a cattle operation that had been losing head slowly over the course of a season before they figured out what was happening." "Kane Hollis," she said. "Pharaoh works with Hollis," Mercer said. "Works for him, maybe. I didn't make that connection until now." She looked at the numbers on the page. 17 head, 6 weeks. Someone patient enough to do it small and careful, someone with access to the ranch's internal records, someone who knew when to move cattle and how to make it look like normal pasture rotation. "He's been here since spring," she said. That's almost 6 months before the fence cut started." "Long enough to learn everything," Mercer said. He said it like the words had a weight to them that he hadn't expected. "He was watching the operation," she said, "learning the land, the schedules, where the gaps were. The cattle theft was probably supplemental. Money while he waited, or proof of concept. The fences were when they decided they had enough information and they were ready to start the real pressure." Mercer looked at her. It was a different kind of look than she'd gotten from him before. Not the recalibrating look, something more direct, more present. "How are you seeing all of this?" he asked. It was not a challenge, it was a genuine question. "I'm keeping the books," she said simply. "Books show you everything if you know what to look for." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the page. "I have to be careful how I handle Vern," he said. "If I move too fast, Hollis knows we're on to him. He'll accelerate whatever he's planning. So you let Vern stay. For now." He picked up the paper and set it face down. "And I start watching what he reports back." She understood. Let the line stay in the water, but know it's there. It was patient thinking, and it cost something to be that patient when you were angry, and she could see that it cost him. "The neighboring ranchers," she said, "Halpert, the Dodd family, the Fenn operation to the east, are they losing head too?" He looked at her. "I don't know. Somebody should find out." "They don't trust me," he said, and it was so plainly stated, so without self-pity, that it hit her differently than she expected. "I've had boundary disputes with Halpert. The Dodds and I haven't been on speaking terms since the water rights business." "They might talk to someone who isn't you," she said. A silence. "You've been here a month," he said, not objecting, just noting. "I have," she said, "and I don't have your history with any of them." He studied her for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up again, the November edge coming into it now, the kind of cold that meant the season had made a decision. "I'll think about it," he said. She had learned that when he said he'd think about something, he meant it, and that the thinking usually ended in yes. She went back to the ledger. He stayed where he was, looking at the turned-over page with the numbers on it that somebody had spent 6 weeks hoping nobody would ever put together. She had put them together. She was going to keep putting things together. And somewhere out there, Silas was hiding from men who were less patient than Rhett Mercer, and she had the sickening sense that the distance between those two facts was getting shorter every week. Mercer thought about it for 2 days, and then he said yes. He didn't frame it as a favor or make anything ceremonial of it. He came to find her in the feed storage room on a Friday morning where she was reorganizing the delivery schedule and said, "Halpert's place is 7 miles northeast. If you're going to ride out there, do it before the weather turns. There's a front coming in Sunday." She went Saturday. Dale Pruitt had told her once that Walt Halpert was a man who'd built his operation through suspicion of everyone, which was not entirely a criticism. Suspicion had kept him solvent through 2 droughts and a cattle fever outbreak that had broken 3 ranches to his south. He was in his 50s, gray and weathered, with a way of standing in his own doorway like he was deciding whether to let the world in or not. He looked at Mara for a long moment when she rode up. "You're the Ellison girl," he said. "At Mercer's place." "Mara Ellison," she said. "Yes." "He send you?" "He told me where you lived," she said. "That's different." Something in his expression shifted, just fractionally. He didn't invite her in, but he came off the porch, which she counted as a version of the same thing. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She told him what she'd found in the ledger. Not all of it, not Vern's name, not the specific numbers, but the pattern. Slow, consistent losses across a season. Cattle recorded as moved but not appearing at the destination. The kind of bleeding that didn't hurt on any given Tuesday, but added up to something serious by the time you noticed it. She watched his face while she talked. He knew. She could see it the moment she described the pattern. A tightening around his eyes. Not surprise, but recognition. The expression of a man hearing named out loud, a thing he'd been trying to explain to himself for weeks. "How many head?" he asked. "For us, 17 over 6 weeks. What about you?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at his barn and the pastures beyond it, like he was doing arithmetic in his head. "Closer to 25, he said. "I thought it was the hands miscounting. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought I was getting old and sloppy." "You're not sloppy," she said. "Someone's been careful, very careful." "Who?" "I don't know yet," she said, which was true enough for the purpose of this conversation. "But I think it's the same person across multiple operations, which means if we compare records, we can see the full picture," he said. She rode home with a promise from Halpert to check his own tallies and send word within the week. She stopped at the Dodd place on the way back. A shorter conversation because Margaret Dodd's husband was away, and Margaret herself was cautious in a different way than Halpert. Not suspicious exactly, but careful. A woman who'd learned to verify things before she committed to them. She listened, asked 2 sharp questions, and said she'd look at the books. When Mar got back to the ranch, Mercer was in the yard talking to Pete, and he looked up when she rode in. She shook her head slightly. Not yet, nothing confirmed yet, and he turned back to Pete without making anything of it. That evening she told him about both conversations. "Halpert admitted losses," he said. 25 head, roughly. He thought he was miscounting. Mercer was quiet. "He's been losing cattle for longer than us." "Which means they started with him," she said. "Tested the method somewhere else before they brought it here. Or they're running it on multiple properties simultaneously, and we're all just finding out at different rates." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a habit she'd noticed. He did it when he was thinking hard about something, a small, restless motion that was the most visible sign she'd seen of what went on under the surface. "Hollis's range is between Halpert and ours. He's positioned in the middle of every operation that's been hit." "Kane Hollis," she said. "What do you actually know about what he wants?" "Land," Mercer said simply. "Always land. He doesn't have enough water on his own range to support the operation he wants to run. He needs either the creek access on my south boundary or the spring on Halpert's east section. Probably both. So he's trying to pressure people into selling." "Or giving up," Mercer said. "There are ways to break a ranch operation that don't require a legal transaction. You bleed it long enough, cause enough problems, make it feel like the land itself is working against you. Some people just walk away." "Like they did with your first place," she said. She'd said it before she fully decided to. It came out quiet and direct, and she watched to see how he'd take it. He went still for a moment. Not offended, she didn't think. More like she'd touched something he kept in a specific place and wasn't used to someone else's hand near it. "Bessie told you," he said. "She thought it was relevant." "She's not wrong." He set the coffee cup down. "The fire was Garrett's work. I couldn't prove it then, and I can't prove it now. He got what he wanted, and I started over." He looked at her steadily. "I built this place so it couldn't be taken the same way. Stone and timber instead of wood. Multiple water sources. A range big enough that losing one section doesn't collapse the whole operation." "But you didn't plan for someone patient enough to work from the inside," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't plan for that." The admission cost him something. She could see it in the way his jaw set afterward, the way he picked the coffee cup back up and didn't drink from it. A man who had rebuilt once from nothing, being told that the thing he'd built to be unbreakable had a crack in it. "Vern's been here 6 months," she said. "How much does he know about the canyon system, the mine tunnels on the east boundary?" Mercer looked at her. "Why?" "Because I've been thinking," she said, "about how this ends. And I don't think it ends with us catching Vern and filing a complaint with the county sheriff and waiting for Hollis to adjust his approach and try again in a year. She put her hands flat on the table. I think it ends when we give them what they think they want, and we're ready for them when they come to take it. Silence. You want to set a trap, he said. I want to set a trap, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Talk, he said. She had been building it in her head for 3 days, since the conversation about letting Vern's information flow back to Hollis, since she'd started understanding the geography of the ranch in the specific way that came from keeping records of everything that moved across it. The canyon country on the east boundary was rough and largely inaccessible except through 2 narrow approaches, one from the north where the canyon wall stepped down in a series of ledges that horses could navigate carefully, and one from the south where the old mine road came through from the abandoned copper workings that had been played out 20 years before Mercer bought the land. The mine tunnels connected the canyon interior to the eastern flank of the property. She'd ridden that country twice with Pete and once alone, and she'd spent one afternoon at the mouth of the main tunnel with a lantern, not going deep but getting a sense of the structure. If a significant portion of the herd were moved into the canyon pasture, she said, it would look like we're consolidating. Easier to manage in winter, plausible reason. Vern would report it. Hollis would see an opportunity. Large number of cattle in an area with limited visibility from the main ranch, accessible from outside the boundary. He'd come for them, Mercer said. He'd come for them, she said. But the south approach through the mine road is the only way to move cattle out of the canyon quietly. The north ledge approach is too slow and too visible. If we have people in the tunnels, you can't move cattle through mine tunnels, he said. I know. I'm not talking about the cattle. I'm talking about cutting off the exit. She picked up the pencil from the table and drew a rough shape on the margin of the nearest paper. The canyon outline, the 2 approaches, the tunnel mouth. They come in from the south on the mine road. They move the cattle toward the north ledge approach because that's the only direction that leads toward Hollis's range. We're in the tunnels on the east flank, which gives us an exit behind them. And the north approach, she tapped the pencil. The north approach is where the main herd is. He was looking at her rough map. A stampede, he said. A controlled one, or as controlled as those things get. She knew what she was saying. Cattle stampedes were not surgical instruments. They were loud and unpredictable, and they didn't distinguish between the people you wanted them to hit and the people you didn't. The hands on the canyon rim trigger the movement. The cattle go north, and they go fast, and anyone trying to move a stolen herd up that ledge approach meets them coming the other way. People can get killed doing that, he said. He said it flat, no judgment in it, just the fact. I know, she said. I know that. But people are already getting robbed. And if Hollis wants this land the way you think he wants it, the fence cuts and the cattle bleeding are the beginning, not the end. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he was going to tell her it was too dangerous, too uncertain, too much. The hands, he said. I need to know which ones I can trust completely. Not almost. Completely. Pete, she said without hesitating. Bessie. Eli. Cole, I think. But he talks too much, and I'd keep him away from any conversation about the specifics until the last minute. Not Vern, he said. Vern needs to think everything is normal until the day it isn't. Mercer nodded slowly. We'd need Halpert, he said. If they're hitting his operation too, he has reason to want this ended. And his range borders the canyon on the north side. We'd need someone on that end to make sure there's no exit we haven't accounted for. I think he'll come, she said. He recognized the pattern when I described it. He's angry. Angry men make mistakes, Mercer said. So do careful men who wait too long, she said. He looked at her across the table with that expression she still didn't have a clean name for, the one that was in the neighborhood of something she was not ready to examine directly. How long do we have before Hollis moves? He asked. I don't know, but the front coming in Sunday will slow him down. After the first hard snow, moving cattle gets complicated. If he's going to do this before winter settles in fully, it's soon. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe less. They sat with that. I'll talk to Pete in the morning, he said, and I'll ride to Halpert myself. She looked at him. You'll go to Halpert yourself? I thought he didn't. He doesn't like me, Mercer said. But this is his cattle and his land, and this conversation needs to happen between the men whose names are on the deeds. That's not pride talking. It's just how it is. She accepted that. It was true enough. She was cleaning up the papers on the table when he said, without particular emphasis, "The map you drew, the tunnel exit position. How did you work that out?" "I walked it," she said. "You went in the tunnels." "Not far." "Far enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Those tunnels aren't safe. The support timbers in the main shaft are 30 years old." "I was careful," she said. "I know you were." He said it in a way that wasn't quite an argument. "I'm saying they're not safe." "Neither is having someone bleed this ranch for another 6 months," she said. "I was weighing the options." He didn't have an answer for that. She didn't expect one. The Sunday front came in the way fronts came in out here. Not dramatically, but thoroughly, dropping the temperature 15 degrees over the course of a day and leaving a hard rime frost on everything by Monday morning. Vern Clasp watched the cattle movement with his usual expression of mild interest, and if he found it significant that more than a third of the herd was being rotated into the canyon pasture for the winter, he didn't say anything about it that anyone could hear. Mercer rode to Halpert's place on Tuesday. He came back that afternoon with a look on his face that was not quite what she'd expected, not the closed-off tension of a meeting that had gone badly, but something more complicated. "He'll come," Mercer said when she asked. "But," she said, because there was clearly a but. "His son is in town. Came up from the south 2 weeks ago." Mercer pulled off his coat and hung it. "Going by the name of Ellison." She went completely still. "Silas," she said. "Apparently." Mercer turned and looked at her. His face was careful, but there was something behind the careful that she recognized as something like concern, which was not an expression she'd seen on him before and didn't know what to do with. Halpert's son ran into him at the saloon in Brixton, said he'd been there about 10 days, keeping a low profile, doing some work for Pharaoh's freight operation. Pharaoh, the name that connected to Hollis, the letter of introduction that had brought Vern Clasp to Black Viper in the spring. "Silas is working for Pharaoh," she said. The words felt strange in her mouth, like something that didn't belong in her own language. "I don't know that he knows what Pharaoh is," Mercer said, "or who he connects to." "Or he knows exactly," she said. Mercer said nothing. He was giving her the space to think it through without pushing it in any direction, which she realized was a particular quality of his she had come to rely on without noticing when she'd started. She sat down in the chair by the window. Outside, the frost was hard on the ground, and the cattle in the near pasture were standing close together the way they did in the cold, their breath making small clouds. Everything was very ordinary looking. Everything was a problem. "He said in his letter that he owed other people besides you," she said. "People less patient." "Pharaoh isn't patient," Mercer said, "from what I know of him." "If Silas is working for Pharaoh to pay off a debt," she said, thinking out loud. Not because she wanted Mercer to hear it, but because saying it helped her see it. And Pharaoh is Hollis's man, then Silas might be the link they used. "My brother knew your ranch. He'd been here dealing with Doyle. He knew the layout, the general operation." "He could have told Pharaoh enough to make Vern's cover story useful," Mercer said. "Or he sold the information directly," she said, not knowing, maybe not knowing, what it was going to be used for. Maybe. The word sat there doing a lot of work she wasn't sure it could handle. "I have to go get him," she said. Mercer looked at her. "Mara." It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed it and kept going. "If Silas is in Brixton working for Pharaoh and Hollis makes his move in the next 2 weeks, Silas is going to be connected to it whether he understood what he was involved in or not. He'll be tied to a cattle theft operation across 3 ranches, and there won't be enough distance between him and any of it. If you go to Brixton, Hollis might have people watching. If they see you—" "I'm not Rhett Mercer," she said. "Nobody's watching for me." He was quiet for a moment. "I can't tell you not to go," he said. "No," she agreed. "You can't. I can say that if you're not back in 2 days, I'm coming after you." She looked at him. That thing was in his face again, the one she'd been not examining. And at this particular moment, with everything that was happening and Silas somewhere in Brixton making choices she didn't understand yet, she didn't have the capacity to deal with what it might mean. 2 days is enough, she said. She left the next morning before dawn, in the cold dark with her breath making clouds like the cattle in the pasture, riding the 7 miles to Brixton on the road that skirted the canyon country and came out on the flat plain west of town. The town itself was small and functional and had the particular quality of winter frontier towns where everything that wasn't essential had closed up and the things that were essential, the saloon, the general store, the livery, were doing steady, reliable business. She found Silas in the livery, not in the saloon, not in the boarding house she'd thought to check first. In the livery, doing exactly the kind of work their father had done when he was young, mucking stalls, hauling water, the anonymous labor of a man who needed to make himself hard to notice. He was thinner than she remembered. His hair was longer, and he hadn't shaved in what looked like 2 weeks, and he had a healing cut above his left eye that someone had put there with something sharp. He saw her and went completely still. "How?" he said. "It doesn't matter how." She stood in the livery doorway and looked at her brother in the cold, dim light, and tried to find the right feeling among all the feelings that were competing for the same space inside her chest. Anger was there. It was always there when she thought about him, but under it was something older and more complicated that she didn't have a clean name for. "You need to come with me." "Mara. Silas." She kept her voice low and even. "I know about Pharaoh. I know about Hollis. I know about the fences and the cattle and the man they put on Mercer's ranch in the spring." She watched his face. "And now I need you to tell me what you actually know, because in about 2 weeks this is going to turn into something that you do not want to be standing on the wrong side of." He set down the tool he was holding. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized from childhood. Caught, yes, but also something like relief. The exhausted relief of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and sees a chance to put it down. "I didn't know what it was going to be," he said. "Tell me what you thought it was," she said. He did. It took a while, and it was not a flattering story, and he told it without trying to make it better than it was, which she credited him for. He had owed money in 3 directions. Pharaoh had bought 2 of the 3 debts and offered to consider the third cleared if Silas could provide some useful information about the Black Viper operation. Not anything specific, just general knowledge, the layout, the number of hands, the boundary details. Silas had told himself it was just information. He had told himself that information wasn't the same as participating in whatever came after. "You knew Pharaoh was connected to Hollis," she said. "I knew Pharaoh did business with a lot of people," he said. "I didn't ask too hard about which ones." "Because you didn't want to know." He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. She looked at him for a moment, at the healing cut and the 2 weeks of beard, and the thinness that came from months of eating only when there was money for it, and the way he was standing like a man who'd forgotten he was allowed to stand up straight. "Can you ride?" she said. "Yes." "Then get your horse and come now." She turned toward the door and then stopped. "Silas, when we get back to the ranch, you answer every question Mercer asks, every single one. Honestly. He's going to want to. You put me in a labor contract without my consent," she said. "Whatever Rhett Mercer wants to say to you, you're going to stand there and hear it." He nodded, just once. Then he went to get his horse. She waited in the cold outside the livery door and listened to the town going about its morning, and somewhere 2 blocks away in the back office of the Pharaoh freight operation, a clock was ticking toward something that was going to happen whether they were ready or not. She intended to be ready. Silas Ellison had not spoken 20 words on the ride back from Brixton, and Mara had not pushed him. There was a specific kind of silence that existed between people who had grown up in the same house and loved the same dead parents, and ended up on opposite sides of a decision that couldn't be undone. She knew that silence well enough by now to let it be what it was. They arrived at Black Viper in the early afternoon. Mercer was in the yard when they rode in, talking to Pete, and he looked up at the sound of the horses and saw Silas, and his face did something careful and deliberate that she recognized as the expression of a man deciding not to lead with what he actually felt. Pete looked at Silas and then at Mara, and then found somewhere else to be. Silas climbed down from his horse slowly, like a man whose body had been reminded of its age by the long cold ride. He was 30 years old and looked older. He stood in the yard of the ranch he'd signed his sister over to and looked at Rhett Mercer and didn't say anything. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. "You have information I need," he said. "After that, what happens between you and me can wait." It was not forgiveness, and it was not a threat. It was exactly what it was. A man separating what was urgent from what was personal and doing it cleanly. Silas nodded. They went inside. Mrs. Tuck appeared in the kitchen doorway, took in the situation in one sweep, and quietly produced food and coffee and then made herself absent, which was its own kind of grace. Silas told it again. The debts, Pharaoh, the information he'd provided. Mercer listened without interrupting. When Silas finished, Mercer asked 3 specific questions. What exactly had he told Pharaoh about the ranch layout, whether he knew the specific timing of any planned move, and whether he'd met Kane Hollis personally? Silas answered all 3. The layout, boundary details, the canyon access, the water sources. Yes, he'd described it. Timing. He'd overheard Pharaoh talking about a window after the first hard frost, but before the deep snow, which matched what they'd already figured. Hollis, once, briefly, at the Pharaoh freight office. A big man, Silas said. Quiet in a way that felt like pressure. He asked me one question, Silas said. He asked if Mercer was the kind of man who'd fight back or the kind who'd cut his losses. What did you tell him? Mercer asked. Silas looked at the table. I told him you were the kind who'd fight back. He paused. I was trying to warn him off. I don't know if it worked. Mercer sat back. It didn't, he said. But it tells me something about how he's going to come at this. He'll bring enough men to overwhelm a fight, not enough to absorb a surprise. Mara had been listening and watching, and now she said, How many men does Hollis run? His permanent crew is 8 or 9, Mercer said. He'll have hired on for this. Pharaoh can put together riders when there's money in it. Could be 12, 15 total. Against our 6, she said, plus Halpert if he brings hands. Halpert's bringing 3, Mercer said. I confirmed it when I rode out there. 9 against 15, maybe, she said. In terrain we know, and they think they know. The canyon changes those numbers, Pete said from the doorway. He'd come back in without anyone noticing, which was a Pete Gideon specialty. 15 men trying to move cattle through the north ledge approach against the herd coming down at them. They can't spread out. The terrain holds them in a line. Silas was looking back and forth between them with an expression that was hard to read, something between disorientation and something that might have been, under other circumstances, a kind of admiration. You already have a plan, he said. We have the beginning of one, Mara said. What we need from you is whether Pharaoh knows you left Brixton. Silas thought about it. I left before the freight office opened this morning. I wasn't expected until afternoon. So they don't know yet. Not yet. Then you're useful, Mercer said. He looked at Silas with the same directness he applied to everything. No cruelty, but no softening either. You know Pharaoh's patterns. You were inside his operation. I need you to think about everything you saw and heard and tell me if there's anything that changes what we're planning. Silas straightened slightly. It was small, nearly invisible, but Mara saw it. The particular shift of a man being given something real to do after months of doing things he was ashamed of. Tell me the plan, Silas said. They laid it out around the kitchen table, all of it, Mara drawing the canyon map again on the back of a feed receipt, while Pete and Mercer added details she'd missed or gotten wrong. The canyon pasture with the bulk of the herd, the mine road approach from the south as the natural entry point, the tunnel exit on the east flank, Halpert's men on the north boundary above the ledge approach, the trigger point, when the stolen cattle were being moved toward the ledge, where the hands on the canyon rim would push the main herd down from the north. Silas listened without interrupting. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands the same way Mercer did, which Mara noticed and filed away in the complicated place she kept things she didn't know what to do with. Pharaoh will come himself, Silas said. He doesn't trust other people to manage the transfer of anything worth that much. He'll be with the group that comes through the mine road. How will he handle the hands? Mercer asked. Will he lead from the front or stay back? Back, Silas said. He's not a coward exactly. He just doesn't like being in the middle of things that could go wrong. Then he'll be the last man through the mine road approach, Mara said, which means he'll be the one we can cut off cleanest. Mercer looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between them that was not quite a question and not quite an answer. All right, Mercer said. He stood up from the table. Pete, start moving the additional cattle into the canyon pasture this afternoon. Normal work pace, nothing that looks like urgency. Cole and Eli ride the east fence like always. He paused. Vern watches what he watches. We don't change anything about how we treat him. Pete nodded and left. Mercer looked at Silas. You stay here, he said, on the ranch. You don't go back to Brixton. You don't send any word to anyone. Understood, Silas said. I'm not doing this for you, Mercer said, plain and direct. I'm doing it because your sister came out here and built something worth protecting, and I'm not going to let it get complicated by you moving around loose where Pharaoh can find you. Silas absorbed that. Mara watched him absorb it and saw, underneath the hit of it, the same recognition she'd had weeks ago. That Mercer's directness was not the same as cruelty, that there was something clarifying about being told exactly where you stood. I know, Silas said. I'm not arguing. 3 days passed. They were strange days. The surface of the ranch operating with its normal rhythms, while underneath everything was taut and waiting. Vern Clasp moved through his work with his usual mild expression, and Mara watched him the way you watched water for the first sign of ice forming, looking for any change in the pattern. On the second day, she noticed him spend 10 minutes longer than necessary checking the canyon fence on the south boundary, the section that overlooked the mine road. She said nothing. She told Mercer that evening with 2 sentences, and he nodded once. On the third evening, Vern didn't come to supper. Pete found his bunk empty at 7 o'clock. His horse was gone from the corral. Tonight, Mercer said when Pete told him. It wasn't a question. Mara was already on her feet. If he rode to Brixton, they need 3 hours to organize and ride back, probably more in the dark. They won't come in the dark, Pete said. They'll come at first light. Easier to work cattle in the early light, and if something goes wrong, you can see what you're doing. First light was 6 hours away. Mercer looked at Mara. Go get some sleep, he said. I'm not going to sleep, she said. I know. Go try anyway. I need you sharp in 4 hours, not running on nothing. She went upstairs. She lay on the bed in the second room on the right with her boots on and her coat hanging on the chair where she could grab it in seconds. And she looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house settling in the cold and the distant movement of the cattle in the canyon pasture. And she thought about her mother's kitchen and the water ring on the table and the way things that seemed permanent turned out not to be permanent at all, and she slept for 2 hours without meaning to. Mercer woke her at 4. He knocked twice on the door frame. The door was already open. And said her name once, quietly. She was on her feet before her eyes were fully open. The yard was dark and cold, the stars hard and close the way they got on clear winter nights, and the hands were moving in the darkness with the contained, purposeful quiet of people who knew what they were doing and had decided to do it. Pete was already gone toward the canyon with Cole and Eli. Bessie was in the barn saddling horses with the speed of someone who'd done it in the dark before. Halpert and his 3 men had arrived sometime while Mara slept and were standing near the north pasture fence in a cluster, their breath making clouds. Silas was in the yard. He was dressed for riding, and he looked at Mara when she came out and said, I want to come. Silas, I know what Mercer said. I'm asking you. She looked at him. This thin, tired, regretful man who was still her brother, who had made a bad decision and then a worse one, and who had spent months in a livery stable in Brixton trying to make himself invisible while the consequences of his choices closed in from all directions. Can you shoot? She said. Better than I used to, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Stay behind me, she said. Do what I say. Don't do anything on your own judgment. He nodded. Mercer came out of the house with his rifle and looked at Silas and then at Mara and said nothing, which she took as acceptance. They rode out in the pre-dawn dark, the ground frozen hard under the horses' feet, the canyon country rising ahead of them as a darker shape against the dark sky. Mara knew this terrain now the way she knew the ledger entries, and the specific detail that came from having gone over it enough times that it lived in her body, not just her head. She knew where the ground went soft near the seep on the north side. She knew where the mine road curved before the main tunnel entrance. She knew the sound the canyon made when wind came through it from the west, a low-channeled note like something breathing. They split at the canyon mouth. Halpert's men went north and up toward the rim above the ledge approach. Mercer, Mara, and Silas went east toward the tunnel entrance. Pete and the others were already in position on the south rim, above the mine road. The tunnel mouth was low, reinforced with old timber that had gone dark and slightly soft with age but was holding. Mercer had brought 2 lanterns, and he lit them inside, shielding the light with his coat until they were deep enough in that it wouldn't show outside. The tunnel smelled of cold stone and old mineral water and the particular dry dustiness of disused spaces. They waited. Waiting was the hardest part. It always was. The mind filled the silence with everything it was afraid of. What if they didn't come tonight? What if Vern had given them different information? What if the plan had a gap she hadn't seen? Silas sat against the tunnel wall with his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the middle distance. Mercer stood near the entrance, listening, the lantern turned down to almost nothing. At 5:45, in that particular dark that was just beginning to think about not being dark, they heard the cattle. Not close. The canyon carried sound in strange ways, but distinct. The particular low protest that cattle made when they were being moved faster than they wanted to go, pushed by riders who didn't care about their preferences. It came from the south, from the mine road direction, and it meant the plan had one thing right. They'd come through the road, they were trying to move the herd. Mercer looked at Mara. She nodded. He went to the tunnel entrance and fired once into the air, the signal for Pete on the south rim. For about 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then the canyon filled with sound. The herd came down from the north in a wave that was more felt than seen in the early dark, hundreds of hooves on frozen ground, making a noise that moved through the rock walls and into the chest. The cattle didn't need much encouragement in the confined space. They were already spooked by the riders pushing from the south, and when the mass of the main herd started moving toward them from above, the narrow canyon did exactly what Mara had calculated it would do. It held the panic in one direction. The shouting started immediately. Men's voices, multiple, some of them Spanish, some not, all of them with the particular pitch of people who have just realized the situation has changed in a way they didn't account for. A shot, then 2 more, not aimed at anything specific, just the instinct of alarmed men. The cattle thundered through the canyon floor heading north, and the riders trying to push them south had nowhere to go but into the canyon walls or back the way they'd come. Mara came out of the tunnel on the east flank with Silas behind her and moved along the base of the canyon wall toward the mine road entrance. This was the part she hadn't told Mercer about in full detail because she hadn't wanted to have the argument. The tunnel exit put them behind anyone retreating back up the mine road, which was exactly where she needed to be. Mercer was 10 yards to her left, and he'd figured it out the moment she moved because he moved with her without a word. The mine road was a narrow cut through the canyon wall, barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, and it was chaos. Riders trying to pull back, horses refusing the narrow space with the sound of stampeding cattle echoing off the walls, men shouting at each other in the compressed panic of a plan that had come apart all at once. In the growing gray light, she could see shapes, riders pulling up, one horse down with its rider scrambling clear, the general dissolution of a group that had expected resistance and not this. She saw Pharaoh before she saw anyone else she recognized, because Silas had said he'd be at the back, and the back of the retreating group was coming out of the mine road cut right toward them. Pharaoh was a heavy-set man on a gray horse, and he was pulling up hard when he saw Mara and Mercer blocking the exit, and his face went through several expressions very quickly. "Stop," Mercer said. He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. Pharaoh looked at them and looked behind him where the canyon was still full of noise and cattle, and he made the calculation that men like him made when the arithmetic stopped working in their favor. His hand moved toward his coat. "Don't," Mara said. She had her rifle up, and it was steady, and she was close enough that there was nothing uncertain about what would happen if his hand kept moving. His hand stopped. 2 of Halpert's men came down from the north rim on the far side, cutting off the other direction. Pete and Cole came through behind the cattle movement on the canyon floor. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes from the first signal shot to this moment, which was how she'd figured it. Quickly enough that nobody had time to reorganize, quickly enough that the confusion worked in their favor rather than against them. 7 men were taken at the mine road exit. 3 more were caught on the canyon floor by Pete and the others. 2 had managed to get their horses up the ledge approach before Halpert's men closed it, but they'd gone without their horses, and in this cold that meant they weren't going far. Pharaoh sat on his gray horse with Mara's rifle on him, and the expression of a man who was already calculating what came next. And then Silas said, "Mara." His voice had a particular quality in it, and she turned without thinking. From the canyon floor, coming up through the mine road cut on foot because his horse had gone down in the first minutes, was Kane Hollis. He was everything Silas had said, big and quiet with that quality of contained pressure. He had a pistol, and it was not pointed at the ground, and he was looking at Mara with the deliberate focus of a man who had identified the correct target. Not Mercer, not Halpert's men on the rim, her. She was the one blocking the exit. She was the one in the way. "Put it down," he said to her. Not loud. That was the thing about him. He didn't use volume as a weapon. "No," she said. She had not moved the rifle off Pharaoh. She was doing the calculation, Pharaoh with his hand near his coat, Hollis with his pistol up. 2 of them. She had 1 rifle. "Mara," Mercer said quietly, from her left. He had not moved, and his voice was perfectly level. "Keep what you have." She understood. She kept the rifle on Pharaoh and trusted Mercer to handle what was on her right. What happened next was fast and not clean, and nothing like how it would look if someone were telling it later around a fire. Hollis moved to his left to get a cleaner angle, and Mercer moved to cut the angle off, and Silas, who had been told to stay behind her and to not do anything on his own judgment, stepped between Hollis and his sister. The pistol went off. Silas went down. Hollis had half a second to register what had happened, and that was enough time for Mercer to close the distance. And what followed was not something that had a heroic shape to it. 2 men in the cold gray light of early morning, one larger and one faster, and it lasted less than a minute and ended with Hollis on the ground and Mercer bleeding from a cut above his eye and breathing hard. Mara was already on her knees next to Silas. The shot had caught him in the left shoulder. High, she thought, the collarbone area, and she had her hands on it before she'd made any conscious decision to move, pressing hard, feeling the hot wet of it through his coat. He was conscious, and he was making a sound that was not words, just the involuntary noise of serious pain, and she was talking to him in a voice she didn't entirely recognize as her own, steady and low and not stopping. "I know," she said. "I know. Keep still. Keep still, Silas. I have it." He looked up at her. His face was gray in the early light. "I was behind you," he said, through his teeth. "That doesn't count." She almost laughed. It was not a good laugh. It was the kind that lived next to crying, but it was real. "It doesn't count," she agreed. "Stay still." Mercer crouched down on Silas's other side. His face was cut and there was blood running into his eyebrow, and he didn't seem to notice it. He looked at the wound with the efficient attention of a man who had dealt with injuries in the field before and said, "Through and through, probably. The angle's right. He needs a doctor, but he's not bleeding out." "How do you know?" Silas asked. He sounded almost normal, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. "Because you're asking questions," Mercer said. He stood. He looked at Pharaoh on the gray horse and at Hollis on the ground, with Cole standing over him, and at the general contained wreckage of a plan that had come apart at the canyon mouth, and his face was doing the careful thing it did when he was managing something large. "Somebody go get the doctor from Halpert's place," he said. "Pete, I need you on Pharaoh. Don't let him off that horse." He looked around at the men. "Anyone else hurt?" Cole had a grazed arm, but he showed it without complaint, barely a scratch. One of Halpert's men had a broken finger from a horse stepping on him in the confusion. That was it. Mara stayed on the ground next to Silas and kept her hands on the wound while around them the canyon morning came fully up, the light going from gray to pale gold on the rock walls, the cattle settling somewhere to the north in the aftermath of the stampede, everything very ordinary and very cold. Silas said quietly, "You were right." About all of it. I know, she said. I mean, not just the plan. You were right to be angry. She looked at him. His face was still gray, but his eyes were clear, and she could see that he meant it, that it was not the sentimentality of shock, but something he had been carrying for a long time and had finally found the moment to put down. I know that too, she said. Are we, He stopped. Started again. Are we going to be all right? She thought about the kitchen table, about the water ring their mother had left, about the bill of sale with her name at the top, and the 2 days she'd spent sharpening herself against a man who turned out to be something different than what she'd built in her mind, about ledger entries and canyon maps drawn on the backs of feed receipts, and the particular silence of riding alongside someone who was thinking about the same problem from a different angle. Ask me again when you're not bleeding, she said. He almost smiled. It looked like something their father used to do. Mercer came back and crouched down beside her and, without saying anything, took over the pressure on the wound so she could flex her hands, which had gone stiff from the cold and the sustained effort. He did it practically, without ceremony, the way he did most things. Their shoulders were almost touching. Barrow's going to talk, he said quietly, not to her particularly, just thinking out loud. He's a man who values his own comfort. When he understands what the charges are going to look like across 3 ranches, he'll negotiate. And Hollis? She said. Hollis will be harder. He paused. But Hollis is on the ground, and his operation is finished, and his hired men are either caught or running through the canyon country in the cold without horses. Hard doesn't mean impossible. The valley will have questions, she said, about all of this, about why you didn't tell the neighboring ranchers sooner what was happening. I know, he said. Halpert already knows, she said. He was here. He saw it. But the Dodds, the Fenn family, I'll ride to every property in this valley and explain what happened and what it was connected to, he said. Whatever they want to say about it, they can say it to my face. He looked at her sideways. Will you come? She looked at him. That thing was in his face again, and she was out of excuses not to look at it directly, out of the convenient distance of emergency and planning and urgency. It was not a complicated thing, she realized, when you actually let yourself see it. It was just a man who had been alone with his work and his rebuilt ranch and his careful surfaces for a long time, asking, in the most practical way he knew how, whether she intended to stay. Yes, she said. I'll come. He nodded. He looked back at the canyon, at the pale light on the rock walls and the settling aftermath of everything, and the hand not holding pressure on Silas's wound was close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of it in the cold morning air. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later. The county sheriff arrived 2 hours after that, having been summoned by a rider Halpert sent before the sun was fully up. Farrow started talking before noon, as Mercer had predicted, and what he said connected Hollis to cattle theft operations across 4 counties, a scope none of them had entirely anticipated. And Kane Hollis, sitting against the canyon wall with his hands bound and his operation in ruins around him, looked at Mara Ellison at one point during the morning's proceedings with an expression that she couldn't fully read. Not respect exactly, something more complicated than that, the expression of a man reassessing the shape of what had happened to him. She didn't say anything to him. There wasn't anything she needed to say. The canyon was quiet by midday, the cattle settled, the frost burning off the ground in the strengthening winter sun, and Black Viper Ranch standing exactly where it had stood before all of this, on its serious dark soil land with the good grass and the creek running through the low ground, unchanged and unbroken. The doctor's name was Aldrich, and he was a compact, unhurried man who had been practicing medicine in this part of the territory for 20 years, and had long since stopped being surprised by what people brought to his attention on short notice. He cleaned and packed Silas's wound at the kitchen table, while Mrs. Tuck held the lamp and Silas gripped the table edge and made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath when the probing went deep. Through and through, Aldrich confirmed, which was what Mercer had said in the canyon and which Mara had been holding on to for the 2 hours it took for the doctor to arrive. Collarbones cracked but not shattered. He'll have limited use of that arm for 6 weeks, maybe 8. After that, he shrugged. Depends on whether he does what I tell him, which, in my experience, is about 50-50 with men his age. I'll do what you tell me, Silas said through his teeth. That's what they all say while it still hurts, Aldrich said, not unkindly. Mara sat across the table and watched her brother's face while the doctor worked, and she thought about the canyon morning, the shot, the way Silas had moved without thinking, putting himself between Hollis and her. She had told him to stay behind her. He had, technically, done exactly that. He'd stayed behind her right up until the moment it mattered, and then he'd stepped in front. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She filed it in the same place she'd been filing complicated things for the past 2 months and decided to let time work on it. The sheriff, a methodical man named Greer, who had ridden out from the county seat with 2 deputies, spent most of the afternoon at the canyon taking statements and inventorying the situation. Farrow was cooperative in the specifically calculating way of men who understood that cooperation was now their primary asset. By the time Greer sat down with Mercer at the long table that evening, Farrow had named 6 specific operations connected to Hollis across 4 counties, confirmed the timeline of the Black Viper infiltration, and identified 3 other properties where the slow bleed cattle theft had been running simultaneously. Greer wrote everything down in a deliberate hand and asked his questions without drama. The woman, he said at one point, looking at his notes. Ellison. She designed the canyon operation? She identified the theft pattern and proposed the strategy, Mercer said. Yes. Greer looked up at Mara, who was sitting at the end of the table because it was her table as much as anyone's by now, and she saw no reason to absent herself. He had the expression of a man updating a file in his head. You've been on this ranch how long? He asked her. Just over 2 months, she said. He nodded slowly. 2 months, he said, like he was placing that fact next to other facts and seeing how they fit. He looked back at his notes. He didn't ask any more questions directed at her, but she noticed that from that point on he addressed her directly when he referenced anything connected to the plan, not looking at Mercer first the way he'd been doing. Small things. She had stopped needing them to feel large in order to notice them. Hollis was transported to the county jail the following morning. He went without speaking, which was the quality Silas had described, that compressed quietness, that sense of pressure withheld. Mara watched him go from the porch and felt nothing particular, which surprised her and then didn't. She had spent her energy on the problem while it was a problem. Now it was Greer's problem and the court's problem, and she found she had no need to carry it further than that. Farrow's testimony, as it turned out, was the piece that tied it together cleanly. He had kept records, not out of integrity, but out of the habit of a man who always wanted leverage over the people he worked with. And those records connected Hollis to the Deacon brothers' failed water dispute with Mercer 3 years back, to the freight operation that had been moving stolen cattle across county lines, and to 2 other land pressure campaigns in neighboring territories that had been unresolved and apparently unconnected until now. When Mercer heard that last part from Greer, he went very still for a moment. Then he said, "The Deacons worked with Hollis." "Looks that way," Greer said. "The survey that was wrong," Mercer said. "The one they used for the water rights claim." "Farrow says he arranged it," Greer confirmed. "The surveyor's been out of the territory for 2 years. We're looking for him." Mara watched Mercer sit with that. The first place, the fire that was officially an accident. The Deacons and their convenient survey. And now this. 3 years of Hollis circling back at the same target from different angles, patient as weather, waiting for the approach that would finally work. "He was always coming back," Mara said. Mercer looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I think he was." She thought about what that meant. To have built something twice, knowing somewhere in the back of your mind that the thing that had burned you out the first time might not be finished. To have kept going anyway, to have made the stone and timber ranch and the well-kept pastures and the orderly barn, not because you were certain it was safe, but because the alternative was letting someone else's persistence become the end of your story. She understood that. She understood it more than she'd expected to, sitting at this table in this house she hadn't chosen and had come to know anyway. They rode out to the Valley properties on a Thursday, 4 days after the canyon. Mercer and Mara, together, the way he'd asked, and she'd agreed. It was a cold, clear day with the winter sun doing what it could and not quite managing warmth, the kind of day that was beautiful if you were dressed for it and miserable if you weren't. The Dodd place first, because Margaret Dodd had looked at the delivery records Mara brought her 2 weeks ago, and had done her own counting in the days since. She met them at the door with an expression that was not warm, but was honest, which Mara had learned to value more than warmth in people she didn't know well. Mercer explained what had happened. All of it, not a sanitized version. The cattle theft across multiple properties, Hollis's operation, the canyon plan, and how it had played out. Margaret Dodd listened and asked 2 specific questions about the legal proceedings, which Mercer answered directly. "You should have come to us sooner," Margaret said. "Not accusatory, just factual." "Yes," Mercer said. "I should have." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Mara. "She's the one who came to see me about the delivery records," she said. "She's the one who saw it first," Mercer said. Margaret Dodd nodded once. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on." It was not a grand reconciliation. It was 2 people in a cold kitchen drinking coffee and talking about cattle records and legal timelines and what the sheriff's office was likely to do and not do about recovery of stolen livestock. But Mara noticed that Margaret Dodd stopped looking at Mercer the way people looked at something they'd decided to be cautious around, and started looking at him the way people looked at a neighbor. Not a friend necessarily, not yet, but someone in the category of people you dealt with honestly because you'd be dealing with them for a long time. The Fenn place was harder. Old Ben Fenn had made up his mind about Rhett Mercer 6 years ago on the basis of a fence dispute that had been nobody's finest hour, and he was not a man who updated his conclusions easily. He stood in his yard with his arms crossed and listened and didn't say much, and when Mercer finished, he said, "So Hollis was hitting my south pasture." "We think so," Mercer said. "Your tally records would show it if you want to check." "I'll check," Fenn said. He looked at Mara. "You're the Ellison girl, Silas Ellison's sister." "Yes," she said. "Silas used to come through here when he was running cards over in Brixton," Fenn said. "Bought a horse from me once, paid cash." He said it like it was the most important thing about the transaction. "Is he going to be all right?" "He'll be all right," she said. Fenn looked at Mercer again. Something in the crossed-arm posture shifted, marginally. "You caught the man who was bleeding us." "We caught him," Mercer said. Fenn said. He uncrossed his arms. "I'll check the tallies. If the losses are there, I'll send word to Greer." He paused. "Come by in the spring. We'll talk about the fence line." He went back inside. Mara and Mercer rode away from the Fenn place without speaking for about a quarter mile, and then she said, "That went better than I expected." "It went better than it deserved to," Mercer said, "on my part." "On both your parts," she said. "Fence disputes have 2 sides." He looked at her sideways. "Did Fenn tell you about it?" "No," she said. "But you said it was nobody's finest hour. That means it wasn't just his." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It wasn't." They rode on. The valley opened up below them on the return route, the winter-brown rangeland and the dark lines of fence and the smoke from the various properties rising straight up in the still cold air. It was not a pretty valley in the calendar sense, but it had a particular quality of realness to it. The kind of landscape that didn't perform, that was just what it was, hard and cold and capable of growing things if you knew how to work with it rather than against it. "I keep thinking about something," Mara said. "Say it," he said. "My brother signed me over to you because he was trying to make a problem go away," she said. "And I came here ready to fight every single thing about the situation. I had 2 days of anger on the road, and I walked into this yard ready to make sure you knew exactly where I stood." "I remember," he said. "And the thing is," she paused, working out how to say what she meant without it coming out wrong. "If Silas had just told me he was in trouble, if he'd come to me instead of running from it and signing my name to a piece of paper, I would have helped him. I would have been angry, but I would have helped. That's the part that still sits wrong with me. Not that he was in trouble, that he didn't think I was someone he could come to." Mercer rode without speaking for a moment. "Some people," he said carefully, "when they're ashamed of something, they can't face the people who know them best. It's not a rational calculation. It's just the shame makes them go sideways instead of straight." "I know that," she said. "I know that's what it was. I'm not saying I don't understand it." She looked at the valley below. I'm saying it cost both of us a lot. And the thing that cost us the most wasn't the debt or the contract or any of it. It was that he didn't trust that I could handle the truth. Mercer said nothing. She hadn't expected him to. It wasn't the kind of statement that needed a response, and he was a man who understood that better than most. Silas healed slowly, the way the doctor had said, and he was a difficult patient in the way that people who'd been independent a long time were difficult patients. Not dramatic about it, but restless, frustrated with his own limitations, trying to use the arm before he should, and accepting the pain as fair penalty for the attempt. Mrs. Tuck managed him with a practical, unsentimental firmness that brooked no argument, and Mara suspected that he found it easier to comply with Mrs. Tuck than with her because Mrs. Tuck didn't know the history. She and Silas talked. Not all at once, not in one long reckoning that resolved everything. It came in pieces over the weeks of his recovery, at the kitchen table in the mornings or on the porch in the brief cold afternoons when he was allowed outside. She told him what the 2 months had actually been. Not the version that made it easier for him to hear, but the real one. The 48 hours of sitting with her anger before she got on the horse. The first week of loneliness. The ledger and what she'd found in it. The slow, difficult process of learning a place she hadn't chosen and the stranger way she'd found herself choosing it anyway. He listened, which was what she needed from him. Not apologies, though he'd made those and they were real enough, and past a certain point apologies were just noise. What she needed was for him to understand what his choices had actually cost, at the level of days. And she could see that he did. The man, Silas said one afternoon on the porch, he didn't specify. He didn't need to. What about him? She said. Are you going to stay? She looked out at the yard, the barn, the corrals with the working horses in them, the canyon country visible above the east tree line. My contract is for 3 years, she said. Mara. Yes, she said. I'm going to stay. Silas was quiet for a moment. He's not easy, he said. Neither am I, she said. That's true, he said, and the way he said it, not as a criticism, just as a plain recognized fact about his sister, was the most normal thing he'd said to her in 2 months, and she felt something in her chest ease that had been tight for a very long time. The legal proceedings moved at the pace legal proceedings moved, which was not fast but was steady. Hollis faced charges across 4 counties. Farrow's cooperation ensured that the case was built carefully, and Greer was a thorough man. Vern Clasp was found in Brixton 3 weeks after the canyon, having made the decision to run that turned out to be the worst decision in a series of bad ones. His testimony added another layer to the picture. The stolen cattle, what could be proven and traced, were recovered where possible and credited against losses where recovery wasn't possible. The Dodd property confirmed 15 head missing. Fenn found 22. Halpert's full count came in at 31, which made him the hardest hit operation in the valley, and also as a result, the most invested in the outcome of the proceedings. He came to the ranch in December to talk to Mercer, and Mara was at the kitchen table when they came in, and he looked at her and said without preamble, I was wrong about the water dispute. 3 years ago. I pushed on the boundary out of... He stopped. I was being stubborn about a thing that didn't matter as much as I made it. Mercer looked at him. So was I, he said. Halpert nodded. He sat down. Mrs. Tuck produced coffee, because that was what Mrs. Tuck did, and the 3 of them talked for 2 hours about the valley and what needed to happen going forward. A proper agreement about water rights and boundary maintenance, a shared system for reporting anomalies in cattle counts, the kind of practical cooperation that should have existed years ago and had been prevented by 2 men's mutual stubbornness and a scheme that had been designed to keep them from trusting each other. She didn't say that last part out loud. She let them work toward it themselves, because it landed differently when you found it yourself. After Halpert left, Mercer stood at the window for a moment looking at the yard, and she looked at his back and thought about Bessie's story of the first place, the fire, starting over on the Callaway wreck with nothing but the intention to make it work. 8 years of building, 8 years of making this range into what it was, 8 years of being careful about who he trusted and why, which had protected him in some ways and cost him in others, the way every strategy that was also a wall eventually cost something. What are you thinking about? She asked. He turned around. The spring, he said. The south fence line needs full replacement, not just patching. And the canyon pasture worked better as a winter location than I'd given it credit for. We could run a rotation through there from November to March, move the pressure off the north pasture during the heavy snow months. She looked at him. That's what you're thinking about. What else would I be thinking about? He said. But the corner of his mouth did the thing it did. The thing that was as close to a smile as his face generally committed to in the middle of a conversation. Come look at the ledger, she said. I've been working out the spring supply costs. He came and sat across from her, and they went through it together. The numbers she'd built for the next season's needs, the projections for the cattle count once the recovered head were properly tallied, the estimates for the fence replacement she knew he'd been putting off. He made 2 corrections and asked 3 questions, and changed one of her estimates based on what he knew about the timber supplier that she didn't, and the conversation moved the way their conversations moved now, 2 people who had been watching each other long enough to have developed a shared shorthand about the thing they were both trying to do. She thought, sometimes, about the woman who had ridden up that lane 2 months ago with a trunk in a borrowed wagon and a temper she'd been banking for 48 hours, ready to fight every single thing about the situation she'd been placed in. That woman had not been wrong to be angry. She had not been wrong about any of it. Not about Silas, not about the injustice of having her name signed to a piece of paper without her knowledge, not about the legitimate grievance of being handed a life she hadn't chosen. But she had been wrong about one thing, and it had taken her 2 months to see it clearly. She had arrived here believing that being placed in an unchosen situation meant nothing she found there could be really hers, that anything she built or learned or came to value inside those terms was somehow conditional, borrowed, waiting to be taken back when the contract expired. That was not how it had turned out. What she had found here, the knowledge of the land, the work of the ledger, the particular understanding that came from watching something complicated from the inside, that was hers. Nobody had given it to her. Nobody could take it. It existed in the same category as everything she'd learned in her father's house and her mother's kitchen, earned by showing up and paying attention and not looking away from the hard parts. The contract was a piece of paper. What she was building was something else. January came in hard and stayed hard, the kind of cold that made the canyon walls creak at night and kept the cattle close to the windbreaks. The days were short and the work was relentless, and there was nothing romantic about any of it. Cold hands and early mornings, and the particular exhaustion of work that didn't stop because the season was difficult. Mrs. Tuck made soup that lasted 3 days and then made more soup. Pete managed the hands with his usual wordless efficiency. Bessie kept the horses in better condition than the weather warranted by sheer stubbornness. Silas, once the shoulder was far enough along, began to make himself useful in the ways he could, mending tack, managing the smaller supply tasks, doing the things that needed doing from a position that didn't require full use of his left arm. He was good with horses, which nobody had known, including Mara, and he spent afternoons in the barn working with 2 of the younger animals in a way that earned him a nod from Bessie, which was the equivalent of a standing ovation from anyone else. He had not talked again about leaving. She had not asked. Some things settled themselves if you gave them room. On a quiet February evening, when the worst of the cold had broken enough that the house didn't feel like it was being besieged from all sides, Mercer came into the main room where she was finishing the month's ledger entries and set a piece of paper on the table in front of her. She looked at it. It was the labor contract. Her name, Silas's handwriting, Cutter Doyle's cramped legal hand. "What's this?" she said. "I'm tearing it up," he said. "I wanted you to see it first." She looked at the document and then at him. He was standing on the other side of the table, no particular expression on his face, but she knew his face well enough now to read what was underneath it. "If you tear it up," she said, "I'm not under any obligation to stay." "I know," he said. "You understand that?" "Yes," he said. "I understand that." She looked back at the document. Her name, written by her brother's hand, binding her to a place she'd ridden into furious and unwilling. 3 years. All that time, sitting on a piece of paper in a lawyer's office while she learned a ranch and built a ledger system and found a cattle theft operation that had been bleeding 3 properties for 6 months and drew a canyon map on the back of a feed receipt. She picked up the document. She tore it in half, then in half again. "I'm staying," she said. Not because of the contract, because I want to. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had a name for now, had given it a name sometime in November without quite registering that she'd done it. It was the expression of a man who had built things twice from nothing and was still, despite all evidence that the world was unreliable, choosing to build again. Equal partners, he said. On everything. Equal partners, she agreed. On everything. It was not a grand declaration. There was no audience for it, and neither of them would have wanted one. It was two people who had come to know each other under difficult circumstances, in the way that difficult circumstances sometimes allowed, without the usual performance, without the cushioning of easy comfort, right down to what they actually were. What they'd found there had been worth keeping. Outside, the February dark was settling over the valley, and the cattle were quiet in the winter pastures, and the creek on the south boundary was running under a thin skim of ice that would be gone in 6 weeks when the melt started, and the land began again its slow, reliable turning toward spring. Black Viper Ranch stood on its serious dark soil with its stone and timber house, and its well-kept barn, and its ledger that now made sense. And the canyon country to the east was just the canyon country, terrain she knew, no longer a threat but a feature of the land she lived on. Some stories are about what people survive. This one is about what they find on the other side of surviving, which is not peace exactly, not the absence of difficulty, but something more durable than either. The knowledge that you can build something in an unchosen place and have it be real. That the people you find rather than choose can matter as much as the ones you were given. That being handed a hard situation and walking into it anyway, eyes open and ready to fight, is sometimes the thing that leads you exactly where you needed to go, even if nobody, least of all you, knew that's where you were headed. Mara Ellison had been sold into a place she didn't choose by a brother who was running from his own failures, and she had walked in with her hands already made into fists. What she walked out of, what she built, what she stayed for, was hers. Entirely and completely hers. And that was the whole of it.